Marriage is a union between one man and one woman. Is that a surprise? Is it fair? Is it hate speech? But most importantly, is it true? Once upon a time in America and Texas, marriage was safe. And once upon a time in America and in Texas, religious freedom was safe. But in just a few short years, because of an out-of-control executives and an overreaching judiciary, a lot of people are wondering if those days are over. As a matter of fact, there's a strong drumbeat right now saying it is over, trying to tell us and convince us that it's inevitable. Marriage will be redefined and religious liberty will be thwarted and will be put at particularly a second-class position. But what we know is that the glory days, if you will, of marriage and religious freedom are not over. We know that we have a role to play on these type of issues. But if some people have their way, they will allow the First Amendment to be run over and to be secondary to the current popular sexual lifestyle choices of some. Now, this clash between marriage and religious freedom continues. We continue to see more instances of that and more cases of that. We saw a case from New York where private business owners essentially were put in a position by state laws that they had to force to shut their business down in order to not violate their religious freedom rights as it regards and relates to the marriage issue. We see New Mexico where a private photographer was put in the same position. And that Supreme Court said that giving up your religious freedom was the price of citizenship. And earlier today, I was in Houston, Texas, the city where I was born and raised. And many of you all, I'm sure, have heard about what's happening to the pastors there and how they're being intimidated. And the mayor there says that the pastors are free game when it comes to this type of government power trying to force them to turn over their sermons. And why? Because they dare talk about the marriage issue from a biblical perspective. So some people think that this discussion about what marriage should be and what it is over. I think we're now just starting to have a real conversation about these issues in a very important way. And one of the most important people who is sparking that conversation is Ryan Anderson. And we're happy he's here tonight. Ryan Anderson researches and writes about marriage and religious liberty. He's the William Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He focuses on justice and moral principles in economic thought. Healthcare and education, has expertise in bioethics and natural law. He's a part of the editor of the Public Discourse, an online journal with the Witherspoon Institute, Princeton, New Jersey. You're going to hear a lot about, in references to his book, What is Marriage?, that he wrote along with some very important folks and was quoted and cited by the U.S. Supreme Court most recently on one of the most important decisions regarding marriage in our time and our history. He also co-wrote the article that led to the book, What is Marriage?, with the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. Mr. Anderson received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude. He is a doctoral candidate in political philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, where he received his master's degree. His research spans the natural law traditions in a conversation with classical and contemporary liberalism. His dissertation, which he will defend October 2014 in about a week, is titled Neither Liberal Nor Libertarian, A Natural Law Approach to Social Justice and Economic Rights. Mr. Anderson was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and he currently resides in Washington, D.C. So let's give a Texas-sized welcome to Ryan Anderson.
Thank you for that very kind introduction and for the warm welcome. As Jonathan mentioned, I work at the Heritage Foundation, so we're a nonprofit think tank. We do public policy research. And that's the vantage point that I'm going to approach tonight's topic of marriage. I'm going to approach the question from that of public policy, from a perspective of philosophy and social science. I'm not going to speak about marriage as a sacred institution. I'm not going to speak about marriage as a biblical institution. I'm not going to speak about the theology behind marriage. I'm going to speak about the public policy behind marriage. And so you won't hear me make any religious arguments or any theological arguments tonight. You won't hear me talk about morality or sexual orientation or any of the things that the cable news hosts try to get us to talk about. I actually want to make an argument, a public argument based on public reasons about what marriage is, why marriage matters, and what the consequences will be of redefining marriage. Now, those who disagree with me, they have a very catchy slogan. It fits on a bumper sticker, marriage equality. And it's a wonderful icon for your Facebook page, for your Twitter account. You can put up the red equal sign that so many of my high school and college and grad school classmates did when the oral arguments and the decision on the Defense of Marriage Act were taking place. But I would wager a guess that everyone in this room is in favor of marriage equality. Everyone in this room wants the government to treat all marriages equally. We all want to see the law treat marriages in the same way. What we have a disagreement about is what sort of a relationship is a marriage. And only if you can answer that question, the title of my book, What is Marriage? Only if you can say what marriage is, can you then say whether or not any given marriage policy is violating marriage equality. So while marriage equality is a wonderful slogan, and it's very good as a bumper sticker, it's completely vacuous and empty when it comes to actually making an argument about policy and about marriage. No one is against marriage equality. What we disagree about is the nature of the marital relationship. And even those who are in favor of marriage equality for same-sex couples would still draw certain lines. They're not going to treat every consenting adult loving relationship as a marriage. So even those who claim to be in favor of marriage equality have to say which lines they're going to draw and why. And if you want the state of Texas to draw the right lines, to draw lines that are based on principle, you have to know what marriage is. And what's been surprising for me and my co-authors is we were doing research for the law article that we did, as we were doing research for the book that we did, was how few the people were on the left who were willing to answer that question. Very few people will actually tell you what they think marriage is. They'll just say, well, whatever marriage is, it has to include same-sex couples. Whatever marriage is, you have to treat gays and lesbians equally. Which just begs the question of whether marriage is inherently a union of sexually complementary spouses or not. It just elides that question completely. So as we were doing research for the book, we wanted to see, well, what sort of vision of marriage do our opponents have? If they won't explicitly answer that question, what is their implicit view? And what we saw was that they more or less view marriage as the most intense, the most important emotional, romantic, caregiving union that you can have. And so what sets marriage apart from other types of relationships is the intensity or the priority. That it has the most of whatever your other relationships have, or it's the one that you feel the most. It's what the philosopher John Corvino says about marriage. He says it establishes your number one person. And then marriage is about establishing who your number one person is. We argue that this vision of marriage, the adult, romantic, intense, emotional union vision of marriage, simply collapses the marital relationship with companionship in general. It can't explain traditional Western marital norms of monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency, and it can't explain why government's in the marriage business. So let me just say a few words about that before I move on to a positive argument for what marriage actually is. Let me explain why I think this vision fails. If marriage is primarily about an emotional union between consenting adults, why need that union be permanent? What is it about a marriage so understood as an intense, emotional, romantic, caregiving union that would require spouses to make a commitment of permanency, till death do us part? If emotions can come and they can go, if they can wax and they can wane, what is it about this understanding of marriage that says that you have to make a permanent commitment to your spouse? Next, why would it have to be an exclusive commitment? Particularly, why would it be a sexually exclusive commitment? Some people argue that their emotional relationship with their spouse and their caregiving relationship with their spouse could actually be enhanced if they were free to seek out sexual fulfillment with people other than their spouse. And on this understanding of marriage, where it's primarily about the emotional, romantic, caregiving bond between adults, what is it that would require spouses to be sexually faithful. It seems like it would just be an optional add-on for those who would desire it, but it wouldn't be required. And then lastly, why would marriage be a monogamous relationship? If marriage is primarily about consenting adult love, why can't 3, 4, or more people establish a marriage? Why can't 3 or 4 people have an intense emotional bond with one another, have romantic feelings for another, want to commingle their assets, visit each other in the hospital, take care of each other? What is it about this vision of marriage that sees it as consenting adult romance that would require 2 and only 2? And then lastly, why is government in the bedroom? On this vision of marriage, why is the state even in the marriage business at all? The state's not in the best friend registry business. It's not in other companionship relationship business. Why is it in the marriage business so understood? If you think marriage is just about your number one person, if you think marriage is about an intense emotional bond. At the end of the day, we think this vision of what marriage is ultimately dissolves the institution of marriage. What this vision does is it says it's just about contract law. It's about consenting adult love. And consenting adult love can come in as many different sizes and shapes as is imaginable. It can be permanent or temporary. It can be sexually closed or open. It can be between 2, 3, 4, or more people. And so ultimately we see that this vision of marriage simply leads to the abolishment of marriage. It dissolves the logic and the rationale behind marriage. But let me add immediately that this vision of marriage isn't distinctively homosexual. There's nothing about this vision of marriage that is somehow something that only gay or lesbian Americans buy into. I think this is a vision of marriage that many heterosexual Americans have bought into over the past 40 or 50 years. The soulmate conception of marriage. This is the vision of marriage that we got out of the 60s and the sexual revolution. This is the vision of marriage that gave rise to the increase of divorce and the increase of extramarital sex, people who fall out of love. If you understand marriage as just about that romantic component, not about something larger, there are many heterosexuals who have bought in to a faulty vision of marriage. And what's happening right now is just the logical outgrowth of that. The push to formally redefine marriage to include same-sex couples is a 40-year later reaction to a bad understanding of marriage that many of our neighbors have been living with since the 60s. And now for those of us who think that that vision of marriage was a mistake, and that the rise of out-of-wedlock childbearing and pornography and the hookup culture and divorce, that all those things were errors, why would you want to double down on those mistakes and continue down this bad road by formally, officially redefining the institution of marriage? That's the question that ultimately got many of the people involved in the marriage debate involved. So let me now move on to answering the 3 questions that I had mentioned when I first started it. I wanted to speak about what marriage is, why marriage matters, and what the consequences are of redefining marriage. So I've kind of set up by saying why I think the case for marriage equality, as it is called, why that case fails, why that case isn't persuasive, why that argument simply leads to dissolving marriage. Let me make an argument for what marriage is, why it matters, and consequences of redefining it. And in this first part, answering what marriage is will be the densest, most philosophical, hardest to follow. I promise you it will get better. But to a certain extent, we now have to make arguments for what a couple of years ago was common sense. What all of my grandparents just knew to be common sense knowledge, we now have to make an argument for what everyone else just knew in their gut. And to do this, we did, my co-authors and I should mention my co-authors. One was a classmate of mine at Princeton, Sharif Gerges. He won a Rhodes Scholarship while he was at Princeton. He went off to Oxford, did his master's degree. He's now back at Princeton doing his PhD, and he's at Yale doing his law degree. A very well-credentialed, intelligent guy. And then our other co-author, Robert George, is a professor at Princeton. And so the 3 of us got together, and we wanted to explain to our secular colleagues why what we believe about marriage wasn't just rational, but was rationally superior to what they thought about marriage. We wanted to point out that the case for marriage could be one at the level of reason. So we went back to Aristotle, and Aristotle had taught us that you can analyze any sort of a community, any sort of an institution by looking at 3 factors of the community. look at the actions that they engage in, look at the goods that they pursue, and look at the commitments that they make to one another. And we illustrate in the book by looking at sports teams and universities. And so since we're at a college, let me illustrate this by talking about a university, a college, an academic community. Academic communities engage in academic action. What are academic actions? University professors, they research and write articles and books. Students then read those books, read those articles. The professors deliver lectures. Students attend the lectures and take notes. The professors will then assign term papers. Students will write the term papers. Professors will grade the term papers. They'll meet for office hours. Those are the sorts of actions that constitute a college or a university as an academic institution. Tailgates and football games and things like that are nice add-ons, but they don't go to the heart of what makes a university, what makes a college, what makes an academic institution distinctively academic. Academic actions do. Now, what are all those actions ordered towards? The research, the writing, the reading, the lecture giving, the note-taking, the question and answer, all of those actions are ordered towards the good of the truth. All those actions, you're seeking to find out what the truth of the matter is. You're seeking knowledge. You're not just seeking to defend whatever opinion you happen to have. You're not just trying to be boastful and show how smart you are and how you can argue with other people and win. Ideally, all those academic actions, what makes a college a good college is that they're trying to discover the truth. So that's the good. And then lastly, what are the commitments? At a university, you have academic integrity. You have an honor code. You have norms of citing all of your sources, showing all of the data, not plagiarizing your papers. All of those commitments, all of those norms that universities live by are meant to channel those actions towards the good of knowledge rather than just puffing up opinion. So if I wrote a research paper and didn't cite the sources that drew my conclusion into question, if I didn't cite the data that cut against my hypothesis, it makes it harder for another researcher to go through and say, wait, I think you made a mistake. But if you cite all of your sources, if you cite all of the data, and you've made a mistake, it's then easier to discover the truth. And if at the end of the day what you care about is the truth, not just your own opinion, you live by those commitments. And that's what a good university looks like. So that's the non-controversial example. Let me turn it to marriage, which is the controversial one. We argue in our book that marriage is a comprehensive relationship. It's a comprehensive institution, and it's comprehensive in those three respects. It's comprehensive in the action that spouses engage in, it's comprehensive in the goods that spouses are ordered towards, and it's comprehensive in the commitments that spouses make to one another. And so we say it's comprehensive in the action that spouses engage in, that they engage in an action that unites them at all levels of their personhood, an action that unites them hearts, minds, and bodies. So it's a comprehensive act that they engage in. We then say that it orders them towards a comprehensive good, not a discrete good like passing the next test or winning the next football game, but a comprehensive good of creating and then raising new human beings. Probably the most comprehensive activity that one can engage in. And then lastly, we say it calls for comprehensive commitments, a comprehensive commitment throughout time, that pledge of permanency, and then a comprehensive commitment at every moment of time, that pledge of exclusivity, forsaking all others, committing to one other. Like I said, this is the densest part of the talk. This is the densest part of the book. This is where we have to do a little Aristotelian philosophy. Let me break it down a little bit more, and then it'll get easier, I promise. So we first say that there's a comprehensive action that unites spouses. And so to help illustrate that, we do a thought experiment. We say, well, what is it that makes me united? How can I, before I even get to the question of how can I unite with another person, we have to think, well, what is it about me that makes me a unity? And we argue that we're not just a ghost in a machine. We're not just a soul that somehow makes use of a body. We're a psychosomatic unity. We're an ensouled body or we're an embodied soul. That we're a heart-mind-body unity. So to unite with another person would require uniting at all those levels. If I want to unite comprehensively with someone, it would have to unite me both hearts, minds, and bodies. That raises the question, well, how can I unite bodily with another person? And so there we said, well, what is it that makes me a single body? Why am I not just a clump of cells? You sometimes hear liberals, the professor I debated yesterday at UT Austin's law school, saying that the unborn child's just a clump of cells. Why is that argument false? Well, the reason why is because the unborn child, like the adult, all of our various bodily systems are integrated and coordinating with each other for the common good of our lives. My circulatory system, my respiratory system, my digestive system, my muscles, my skin, my bones, all the various parts are all integrating, coordinating with each other for my biological life, just like they're doing for yours. Now, all of those systems I mentioned, we're complete as individuals. With respiration, I'm breathing, exhaling, inhaling on my own. Circulation, the heart's pumping the blood throughout my veins, all by myself. Locomotion, when I finish this lecture, I'll walk out of here on my own. Digestion, when I eat dinner on my own. I'm complete with all of those functions except for one. Every one of us in this hall tonight, we're all complete in all those functions except for one function, where we're radically incomplete. We're half of a potential unit that can engage in a single, integrated, unified, united action. It's the action of reproduction. So that when a man and a woman unite in that conjugal act, they don't just rub up against each other or interlock. If I gave you a hug or stuck my finger in your ear, it's not that sort of union. It actually forms a true unity, a comprehensive unity with respect to a single organic biological function. So when the Hebrew scriptures talk about the two becoming one flesh, they're not simply speaking poetically or metaphorically. They're not saying, well, the two love each other so much, it's as if they become one flesh. They're actually revealing something at the biological and metaphysical level that's reality, a concrete reality that a man and a woman, when they become husband and wife in that conjugal act, unite so completely as one flesh that 9 months later, it might require a name. And that then begins to tell you something about the good that the marital community is ordered towards. That the lovemaking act is also the life-giving act. And so in the same way that all those academic actions that I mentioned are ordered towards the academic good of knowledge of the truth, so too the marital act is ordered towards the marital good of that creation and then raising of new human life. So the spouses commit to each other, they unite comprehensively, they then create new life, and then they commit to that new life. This is a comprehensive good that's at stake here. It's not the good of something discrete, closing a big sale, winning a big football game, acing an exam. Those aren't comprehensive goods in the way of creating new life and then raising new life to appreciate goodness in all of its forms. Good spouses who seek to be good parents try to raise their children to appreciate human goodness in all of its variety. And that's what makes us a comprehensive good, we argue. And then lastly, we say that it therefore demands certain comprehensive commitments. The commitment throughout time, that pledge of permanency. You're not holding anything back. You don't have an escape clause. You don't have that golden parachute. You don't have plans to get out of the relationship. If you did, I pledge to love and honor you except for X, Y, and Z, you haven't really united comprehensively throughout time because you have that holding back, that condition attached to it. Likewise, this vision of what marriage is can explain why the type of exclusivity that marriage calls for is a sexual exclusivity. None of you are cheating on your spouse by attending tonight's lecture. Marriage doesn't call for intellectual exclusivity. If tomorrow morning you go and you play basketball or you go to the gym with someone other than your spouse, you're not cheating on your spouse. It doesn't call for athletic exclusivity. But if you sleep with someone other than your spouse, you are cheating on them. You're violating the type of exclusivity that marriage calls for because it's that sexual act that transforms ordinary companionship and friendship, unions of hearts and minds, into the marital, into the comprehensive domain by making it a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. And so this vision of what marriage is can explain why the marital norm attached to marriage of exclusivity is that this is the action that you do with no one other than your spouse, because this is the action that's the distinctive action of marriage. Now, this basic argument for marriage is something that my co-authors and I find in ancient Greek and Roman philosophers. We see it in both the Hebrew, the Christian, and the Islamic traditions. We see it in Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Kant. We see it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. None of them articulate it in this precise, philosophically jargoned variety as we do. But they all, within their own particular traditions, their own particular vocabularies, they're given philosophical, theological, or political traditions. They're articulating something that approaches this basic vision of marriage. And so this suggests to my co-authors and me that there's something universal and natural about this understanding of marriage. That what all these different thinkers were trying to get at is a truth about human nature. It's a truth in the created order about being created male and female, and what that creates is a possibility for men and women uniting as husband and wife, and then creating children and being mother and father to those children. And that different traditions with different vocabularies, more or less throughout all of human history and across the globe, up until the year 2000, have been trying to articulate something that approaches this understanding of marriage. So you could say, all right, that's fine. You and your co-authors, you've given this Aristotelian philosophical explanation of what marriage is. And you've answered that question of what is marriage. Why should we care? Why should the state of Texas care? Why does it matter? So let me pivot to the second question. Why does marriage matter? And more specifically, why does marriage matter for public policy purposes? You could give a different argument for why does marriage matter as a sacrament, or why does marriage matter as a covenant, as a churchly institution. Here, why does marriage matter as a public institution, as a policy institution? And we argue that marriage really exists from the state's perspective to bring together a man and a woman as husband and wife, so they're then equipped to be mother and father to any children that union might produce. That marriage is based on an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on a biological fact that reproduction requires a man and a woman. And it's based on a social reality that children deserve a mother and a father. And that marriage is about uniting those people in a stable, permanent relationship. Now, whenever a baby is born, a mother's always close by. She's normally in the same room. The question, that's a fact of biology. The question for policy, the question for culture is, will a father be close by? And if so, how long? And marriage is an institution that different political communities, more or less throughout history up until the year 2000, and across the globe, have used, have devised, have implemented as the institution to maximize the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them, committed to each other, are committed to that child. And this is the public purpose of marriage. This is what gets government in the marriage business. It's not because government cares about your love life or my love life because government's a sucker for romance. That's not why government's in marriage. Government's in marriage is because that union of a man and a woman can produce a child, and that child deserves his or her mom and dad. Now, part of this understanding of marriage is based on a truth that there's no such thing as parenting. There's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering, that men and women interact with their children in discrete and tangible ways. In the book, we quote Rutgers University sociologist David Popenoe, who had gone through all the social science on parenting back when the big social question was, or the big social problem that was being explored was single parenthood. What happens to children who are being raised by single moms, don't have their fathers involved? And he went through and he looked at all the social science on this. And this was his conclusion. Quote, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender-differentiated parenting is important for human development, and that the contribution of fathers to child-rearing is unique and irreplaceable." He then concluded, quote, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being, end quote. Now you can illustrate this with thought experiments. If I told you that it's Saturday morning and that a 5-year-old boy is in the living room wrestling with one of his parents, and this parent is teaching the 5-year-old boy how to be masculine without being violent, that it's okay to put people in headlocks, but it's not okay to bite or to pull hair or to gouge out eyes. Which parent is most likely in the living room? And the laughter suggests that you see what I'm getting at. Almost always it's the father that's going to be wrestling with the 5-year-old boy in the living room. And this isn't because we've engaged in gender stereotyping in which only fathers can wrestle in living rooms. This is what comes naturally to dads. This is what dads enjoy doing with their 5-year-old boys. In the same way that it's most likely the father that's throwing the newborn baby in the air, and it's the mother who says, "Honey, not so high." And again, it's not because we've engaged in gender stereotypes in which women have to caution their husbands not to throw their kids through the roofs. It's that this is what comes instinctually to mothers. Especially after you've carried a child in your womb for 9 months, mothers tend to be the more protective, the more nurturing, the more caring. Fathers tend to be the ones who engage in rough and tumble play. That's the phrase that the sociologists use for what they do on Saturday morning in the living room. Fathers tend to do that sort of thing. And then when you step back from that anecdote, I asked you to do the thought experiment of what's going on Saturday morning in the living room. When you step back and you say what the father's doing with the 5-year-old boy, what he's doing maybe in the backyard throwing around a football with the 10-year-old boy, what he's doing helping his 15-year-old boy get ready for his first high school dance. What the father's doing there is he's helping his son channel distinctively masculine tendencies in a constructive rather than a destructive direction. And when you look at the social science, taking a step back, you see that boys who grow up without their fathers are more likely to commit crime, do drugs, drop out of school, precisely because it's that father who tends to play that role for their sons. Now, dads tend to do something distinct and complementary for their daughters. Fathers tend to be the ones who police who their daughter is dating. Fathers tend to be the ones that scare away bad boyfriends. Partly this is because fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to be larger than mothers. Fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to have deeper voices than mothers. Fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to have once been young men. It used to be always, but with the transgender movement, you can't say that any longer. So fathers, on average and for the most part, used to be young men themselves, and say they know what the wrong sort of young man might be looking for in his daughter, and he's a little more sensitive to that. A father who's married to his daughter's mother also models what a good male-female relationship looks like, and he models what his daughter should be looking for in a suitor, a potential boyfriend, a potential husband. So then when you step back from the anecdotal example and you look at the social science, you see that girls who grow up without their fathers more likely to start sexual activity earlier, more likely to be pregnant before getting married. Now, this social science is so well known. Let me read you a quote, and then I'll ask you who the speaker is. We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems, or run away from home, or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Who's the speaker? President Obama. Before he evolved on the marriage issue. Now, why is it that President Obama has spoken so eloquently about the importance of fathers? Exactly. And in a commencement address that he gave, he explains exactly that point. He addressed the all-male graduating class of Morehouse College. And this is what he said. I have tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for me, my mother and me. I want to break that cycle. Now, President Obama is the example that not every child who grows up outside of the married mother-father household is somehow destined for failure. He's done pretty well for himself. But he would be the first to tell you that it was harder, that he and his mother faced an uphill battle because his father wasn't involved with him or with his mother. And so this isn't to say that somehow if you grow up with a single mom, you're somehow destined for failure in life. But it is to say that the social science is so clear that Obama starts that quote with, "We know the statistics." And he rattles off crime, poverty, high school dropout rates, drug use. And then he explains how it's not just for those discrete individuals, but he says the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. And that's what explains why government's in the marriage business, why marriage matters for public policy. If you look at marriage in the past 50 years, you've seen that over the past 50 years, we've had a breakdown of the marriage culture. And during that time, that's when we've seen child poverty rise and social mobility decrease, and we've seen crime increase, and we've seen welfare spending explode. So if you care about both limited government and social justice, if you care about the poor and you care about freedom, this is much better served by a healthy marriage culture. It's much better served by an intact civil society than by a big government solution that, on the one hand, tries to replace the role of the father by being a welfare program, and then also replace the role of the father by being a police program. And so what we've done in many communities is that we've broken down the family and we've tried to replace it with a big government solution of either a police or a welfare program. So marriage is a society's least intrusive, least restrictive way of ensuring that children grow up to be law-abiding, productive members of society. That if you can't get that mom and that dad to commit to each other and commit to take responsibility for that child, you're going to be left with a government solution trying to pick up the pieces, doing it at great cost to taxpayers and not producing particularly good results. This explains why the government's in the marriage business, but it's not in the baptism or the bar mitzvah business. Those truly are just the domain of the church and the synagogue. But marriage is something that's both a sacred institution for the churches and synagogues and mosques, but it's also a public institution. And it matters that the state gets marriage correct. All right, so you could say that you're following, that you tracked with me for the first question, what is marriage? A comprehensive union where sexually complementary spouses unite in a comprehensive act that leads towards a comprehensive good, and they make comprehensive commitments to each other. And then you could say, all right, and it matters for public policy because kids need a mom and a dad, and the state needs to get these men and women to commit to each other and commit to their children. You could say, but all right, but what's the harm of redefining marriage so that same-sex couples can get married? What's the big deal? What are the consequences to redefining marriage? So in this last part of tonight's presentation, let me answer that question, and I'm going to point to 3 consequences of redefining marriage. And all 3 fall under the general rubric of ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences. That the law will teach. The law will either teach that marriage is a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses that's ordered towards creating children and then uniting children with their mom and their dad, or the law will teach marriage is about consenting adult love of whatever size, shape, and commitment the consenting adults want to place on their love. It can't be neutral between these two visions of what marriage is. And so the law will teach, and when the law does that, it will shape culture. Culture then will shape our beliefs, and then our beliefs will shape our actions. So all 3 of these consequences I'll mention fall under that general rubric of ideas having consequences and bad ideas having bad consequences. So the first consequence of redefining marriage, if you make marriage a genderless institution, you have no institution left in civil society that upholds, even as an ideal, that every child deserves a mother and a father. What redefining marriage does is it makes marriage more about the desires, the romantic feelings of the adults involved, rather than the needs or the rights of the children involved. What redefining marriage does is it sends the signal that men and women are interchangeable, and so therefore mothers and fathers are replaceable. And if you doubt that the law has the capacity to teach in this way, take a look at what's happened in the past 40 or 50 years as a result of no-fault divorce. Prior to the introduction of no-fault divorce, if you would file for divorce, you would cite one of the 3 A's from the common law tradition. They were abuse, abandonment, and adultery. These are serious reasons for saying a relationship that had an expectation of permanency, the state now had to declare over. My spouse is abusing me, my spouse has committed adultery, my spouse has abandoned me. With the introduction of no-fault divorce, you could now abandon your spouse for any reason indeed for no reason at all. You didn't even have to cite grounds for the divorce. That's the idea behind no-fault divorce. You don't have to cite fault. Some scholars refer to it as unilateral no-fault divorce to emphasize that one party can file for the divorce without citing fault and without even getting the other party's consent. So that in many jurisdictions you have a greater legal obligation to your roofer and your plumber than you do to your spouse. There's no such thing as unilateral no-fault, get out of your roofing contract. You can't do that. And now what happened here? The law taught something. The law taught that marriage need not be permanent. You can get out of marriage for frivolous reasons. And the divorce rate more than doubled. Now, not all of this was a result of the law. The law shapes culture, but in this case, culture also shaped the law in the first place. It's that bad vision of marriage, that marriage is just about consenting adult love, that gave us no-fault divorce to begin with. Because the popular 60s slogan that marriage should last as long as the love lasts. And so this understanding of the reform of divorce law is that, well, when the love has died out, the marriage should just be declared over. What have we seen in the past 50 years? 50 years ago, births to single mothers were in the single digits. Today, 40% of all Americans, 50% of Hispanics, and 70% of African Americans are born to single moms. That's the reality that President Obama was talking about before he evolved on marriage. So many people have said that the biggest social crisis America faces right now is the problem of absentee fathers. But the question that I would pose to President Obama now that he has evolved is, how do we as a society insist that fathers are essential if the law redefines marriage to make fathers optional? That's the first consequence of redefining marriage under the rubric of ideas having consequences. Second consequence is that the redefinition of marriage won't stop here. I mentioned at the beginning that the vision of marriage that some on the left are pushing as a logical matter has no defense for monogamy, exclusivity, or permanency. Let me now show you that there are activists actively working to undermine those norms by introducing you to 3 new words. I'll introduce you to 3 new words that have been used by activists to describe how they would like to see marriage further redefined. The first is the term throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. Take the word couple, chop off the C, and then add a THR. This was a New York magazine. New York Magazine is one of the more prominent left-of-center publications coming out of Manhattan. It's not really a fringe publication. It's kind of a standard issue New York Magazine. And what's standard in New York might become standard in Texas if you give it enough time. So the argument here is that if 3 people, they can live with each other, they can love each other, they can have a joint bank account, they can visit each other in the hospital, why can't they have marriage equality? If you go before the Supreme Court and you sue for marriage equality for the same-sex couple, on what grounds would you deny marriage equality to the same-sex throuple or to the opposite-sex quartet? Because the way that we arrived at monogamy in Western law and culture is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in that comprehensive marital act that can then produce new life. And every new life has one mother and one father. And marriage is about uniting those people in a stable, permanent, exclusive union. But once you get rid of the male-female part, once a court says the male-female part is arbitrary and full of animus and bigoted and irrational, what's the principal basis for monogamy? What's magical about the number 2 once you've said the male-female part is irrational? So that's the term throuple. The next is the word monogamish. Monogamish, it's a play on the word monogamous, but instead of being a union of 2 and only 2 exclusively, it's a union of 2 that's sexually open. That's where the ish, monogamish, comes in. This was in the New York Times Sunday magazine. New York Times Sunday magazine is probably the most high-profile American publication. And this was in a profile of the gay rights activist Dan Savage. And during a portion of the profile, they asked him, well, what can straight couples learn from gay couples? And he said, well, one of the things that I think gay marriage will do is it'll open up greater flexibility into heterosexual marriage, that they could learn the virtue of the monogamish relationship. And his argument was that sexual exclusivity, monogamy, is an outdated hangover, holdover from an outdated Judeo-Christian ethic in which you think that you can have all of your sexual desires fulfilled by one person for the rest of your life. And that because you have this unrealistic expectation, that's why so many marriages end up having adultery, end up having infidelity, because people aren't going to be fulfilled, and then that's what then causes all of marital conflict. The argument here is that it would be much better if, provided there was no deceit and no coercion, so it's open and honest, if spouses would be free to seek out sexual fulfillment with people other than their spouse. That could actually enhance the emotional connection, it could enhance the caregiving part of marriage. There's no reason why marriage has to be sexually exclusive. And it makes sense if, on this vision of marriage, that marriage is primarily about the adult emotional commitment and the caregiving, why would marriage, so understood, also have to be sexually exclusive? His argument was that, look, for those who want to keep doing the sexual exclusive thing, fine, but for others, this could actually open up the possibility of the monogamish relationship. So what used to be called the vice of infidelity would be redefined as the virtue of monogamish. The last term is just now slightly over a year old. It was in the Washington Post in an op-ed written by a lawyer just after the Supreme Court ruled on the Defense of Marriage Act case. And this is the word wed lease. Wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. And if wedlock denotes something that's strong, sturdy, and permanent, wed lease is meant to denote the exact opposite. Wed lease is a temporary marriage license. Just like you can lease a car or lease a house, the argument here is that you should be able to lease your spouse. The problem with Western marriage law is it's a holdover from the Judeo-Christian tradition in which you think that you can pledge your love and fidelity to one person till death do you part. And it's unrealistic to think you can be faithful and live in a loving, committed relationship to one person forever. And because so many people set up this unrealistic expectation, that's why we have so many divorces. You're expecting a permanent relationship, somewhere along the lines it's not working out, then you have to get divorced, and that's what causes all the negative consequences. That's what tears your heart, that's what ruins your life, because you were expecting permanency and you didn't get it. But he says you shouldn't have expected permanency in the first place, it's unrealistic, and that we should start offering the option of wed leases, expressly temporary marriage license, a 5 or 10-year marriage license, which could then be renewed on good behavior. So if after 5-10 years it's going well, you can renew it. If it's not going well, it would just automatically dissolve. You would just walk away. I didn't sign up for wedlock, I signed up for wed lease. No harm, no foul, no broken heart, no disturbed households. Or so the argument goes. Now, I said I'm not going to say anything about theology or morality here. But think about the public policy costs. Think about the social costs of thruples, monogamish relationships, and wed leases. The purpose of state marriage law is to encourage a man and a woman to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that any children they have might have a father and a mother. But the wed lease, the monogamish relationship, the thruple, all of those things increase the likelihood that men and women have multiple sexual partners to whom they are not committed. That's exactly what takes place with the monogamish relationship, with the wed lease. Multiple sexual partners with limited commitment. What it does is it increases the odds of creating fatherless children and fragmented families. So it directly undercuts the public purpose of marriage in the first place. And yet all three of these revisions follow as a logical matter, as night follows on day, once you get rid of the male-female part. Once a judge says the male-female part of marriage is irrational, arbitrary, and bigoted, why limit marriage to monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency? Why not marriage equality for thruples, wed leases, and monogamish relationships? So that's the second consequence. The redefinition of marriage doesn't have a stopping place. Let me mention the third. This is the one that we're experiencing first, chronologically, but I actually think that the first two are more important for the institution of marriage. That those first two consequences that I mentioned matter the most for marriage because they will do the most to dissolve the marital relationship. But the third of the consequences for religious liberty. I said that the law teaches, and if the law starts teaching that those who believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman are believing something that's backwards and irrational and bigoted, it's only a matter of time before the law starts treating those people as backwards, irrational, and bigoted. And so we saw that after the Massachusetts Supreme Court redefined marriage in that state, Catholic Charities adoption agencies were forced to shut down. We've seen that happen in Massachusetts, in Illinois, and where I currently live in Washington, D.C. And now these adoption agencies, they weren't trying to prevent gays and lesbians from adopting from the government-run agencies. They weren't trying to prevent gays and lesbians from adopting from the secular humanist charities. They were just asking for the freedom to be left alone to run their agency in accordance with their beliefs, to find homes for orphans with married moms and dads. And the state said, no, that's discrimination. And in the state of Massachusetts, it was very clear this had nothing to do with funding, it had to do with licensing. It's illegal to run an adoption agency without a state-issued adoption license, and the state said, we will not issue you that license unless you agree to place children with same-sex married couples on an equal footing as you do with married moms and dads. The charities argued, wait, we have social science that show that mothers and fathers aren't interchangeable and that children do best with a married mom and dad. We also have the First Amendment that protects, presumably, our religious freedom. And this government's in all three jurisdictions saying we don't care. And so they were forced out of the adoption space. This does absolutely nothing to help children. Shutting down adoption agencies does not make it more likely that more children get adopted. All it does is score a point for political correctness. It scores a point in the adult culture war with children as the victims, precisely because the law will now be teaching that those who believe the truth about marriage are actually irrational, arbitrary bigots. Now, it's not just the charities. We've also seen this take place with professionals. We've seen photographers, florists, bakers, innkeepers, most recently, as Jonathan mentioned, a farmer up in New York State. Professionals whose profession intersects with the wedding industry. Professionals who were asked, could you be my wedding photographer? Could you bake my wedding cake? Could you do the floral arrangement for my wedding? And they politely declined. They said, we don't want to use our God-given gifts and talents to tell a lie about marriage, to celebrate marriage that we don't actually think is marital. They weren't refusing to serve gays and lesbians. I mean, not a single case that we know of have they said, oh, we have a policy of just not providing services to gay or lesbian people. They were happy to bake a birthday cake, to do a get well soon floral arrangement. Many of these professionals actually had long-standing relationships with their customers. And it was only when they asked to do the wedding service that they said, we can't do that, our conscience won't let us. And yet in all of these cases, the professionals have been sued. Jonathan mentioned the case out of New Mexico. Elaine Hugan, an evangelical Christian in New Mexico, was forced to pay $7,000 in fines. I think they ultimately dropped the fines, but when she lost her case, that was the penalty. And I don't think she ended up having to pay it. But still the point was that she lost that case, and now she's been told that if she's going to continue doing photography, she has to do both same-sex and real marriages. In the concurring opinion, as Jonathan mentioned, the judge, when it got up, they litigated this all the way to the New Mexico Supreme Court, and the concurring opinion said the price of citizenship is that Elaine has to leave her faith aside and take the pictures for the same-sex wedding. And when I read through that, I had to stop and reread it a couple times, because I thought the judge was going to say the price of citizenship in a free and pluralistic, diverse, tolerant society like ours is that the same-sex couple should just go to a different photographer. That evangelical Christians in the state of New Mexico don't have monopoly on the photography business. That there are plenty of photographers who are in favor of same-sex marriage and who are in favor of making money, and they would have gladly been the wedding photographer for this service. But that's not what he said. He said that every photographer in the state of New Mexico has to take the same-sex wedding photos. The most recent case is out of New York State. It involves Catholic farmers. They rent out their barn for about a dozen weddings a year. They live on the second and the third floor of the barn, and they rent out the first floor for weddings. They were asked by a lesbian couple, can we have our wedding there? And they said, we can't host a same-sex wedding in our house. This isn't what we think God wants us doing with our lives and with our home. They were then sued under New York State's human rights statute. They were forced to pay a $13,000 fine, $10,000 to the state of New York and $1,500 to each of the women for the pain and suffering that this caused. This is not how a free, diverse, pluralistic, tolerant society exists. This is how a society that's trying to coerce and silence those who have politically incorrect opinions exists. And as Jonathan mentioned, that's what's taking place right now in Houston. No one seriously thinks that those pastors were engaging in election fraud when they were giving their sermons. But this is all about intimidating them so that they won't speak up in the future. It's about chilling, it's about silencing speech. That's the third consequence, is that the law will teach something about this view of marriage, and it will teach something about these people who hold this view of marriage. And what's interesting about this is that throughout the past decade, one of the popular slogans that the left uses is that we just want the freedom to live and to love how we want to. We just want to be left alone to live our lives how we want to love how we want to. No one was preventing that from happening in the first place. Even 10 years ago, there were no laws against same-sex marriage. And this is one of the most frustrating things about engaging in this debate in the public square, is that they would say, Texas voted to ban same-sex marriage. That's not what you voted to do. You voted to define marriage as the union of a man and a woman for public policy purposes. But two people of the same sex were free to live with each other and love each other. They were free to go to a liberal house of worship and have a wedding ceremony performed. They were free to work for a progressive business and to receive marriage benefits if the house of worship chose to and if the business chose to. Nothing about that was illegal. There was no ban on a gay couple or a lesbian couple living with each other, loving each other, getting married in a church, getting marriage benefits from a business, if all of those consenting adults chose to. The coercion in this case works in the exact opposite direction. The coercion that we're seeing is that individuals, Catholic charities and other religious charities, and businesses who don't believe that the union of two people of the same sex is a marriage are being forced by the government to treat the union of two people of the same sex as if it's a marriage. It's not a live and let live situation. It's actually a government imposing this set of values on those who may believe something different. And that has been completely lost within this narrative. I'm sad to say even the conservative media continues to say that the Supreme Court struck down such and such a state's ban on same-sex marriage. But when you ban something, when the mayor of New York City tried to ban large sodas, he was actually going to make it so you couldn't buy big gulps. It was illegal. There would be a penalty attached. We didn't ban same-sex marriage. And I think, but using that language was actually very crafty for the other side, because who would be in favor of a ban? We're very liberty-loving people in America. So it already loaded the dice. In the same way that the phrase marriage equality loaded the dice, who could be against equality? So too the idea that you were passing a ban on something loaded the dice, or you were preventing someone's freedom to marry. The other side has been very good at their language. All right, so with that, I'll stop. It looks like we might have some time for some questions. It looks like Jonathan might moderate those, and I'll be happy to try to provide answers.
Excellent. Great job. Thank you so much. Okay. Make sure the microphone's on, and I'm going to step out in the audience. I just want to say this is could be a very interesting part too, because if you haven't seen Ryan talk before, maybe you've seen him on the national media. He is one of the most sought-after spokesperson on these issues on the national media. I told my staff I wanted to play the Rocky song when he came on at the beginning of the program, because if you've seen some of the things that he's been engaged in, it seems like he's in that kind of boxing ring, and but he holds himself well. So anyway, I'm going to step out in this crowd, and if you've got a couple of questions, we're going to take some of those, and I guarantee you Ryan will know how to answer them. So if you'll just do the hand, and I'll walk over here. And if you'll stand up and take the microphone, and if you want to ask Ryan a question, and then don't.
Okay. My name is Janet Howard. I'm with Dallas Eagle Forum. Would you repeat again what the Albuquerque Supreme Court, or the New Mexico Supreme Court said? I
Sure.
just can't believe that.
The phrase they use, the direct quote is the price of citizenship, and that the price of citizenship was that Elaine had to leave her religious convictions behind and serve all customers. And her problem, it wasn't that she refused to serve all customers, it was that she didn't want to serve same-sex weddings. So some people, you remember when Arizona was debating religious liberty, they said, we're going to have homosexual Jim Crow laws. That was the headline that actually ran in USA Today, if I remember correctly. No one was proposing that we were going to have businesses that were going to refuse to serve gays and lesbians, or that we were going to have, if you think about what Jim Crow actually was, it was government-forced segregation. No one was suggesting that. The only religious liberty concerns that we know of have to do with the actual wedding ceremony and not being coerced to celebrate a same-sex wedding when you don't believe a same-sex union is a marriage.
Thank you. Ma'am, you had a question next? If you'll stand up.
My name's Angela Kransky. I'm just a concerned wife, mother, and citizen, and I want to know what your opinion is and what you think the rest of us can do given last Monday's development.
Your law is still being litigated. So in the state of Texas, your case is being appealed to the Fifth Circuit, as is Louisiana. Louisiana has the distinct honor of being the only state to have their marriage law actually upheld since the Defense of Marriage Act was struck down by the Supreme Court. Their case is also going to the Fifth Circuit. Now, the Fifth Circuit happens to be one of the more reasonable, logical, and actually like law-governing bodies within the United States. They typically tend to actually apply the law as written. They don't legislate from the bench. So there's a chance that your law could be upheld by the Fifth Circuit. There's a chance that Louisiana's law could be upheld by the Fifth Circuit. Then it would go to the Supreme Court. Indications don't look good from the Supreme Court. It looks like Justice Kennedy has made up his mind on this. That's why they hadn't granted cert for the other states, because those laws had all been struck down, and it looks like there was a majority of Supreme Court justices who said, well, we just want to keep those lower court rulings in place, so there's nothing for us to even evaluate. And I think it's crafty for the liberals in the Supreme Court to do that, because it doesn't draw the attention of Roe v. Wade. Justice Ginsburg has said that the problem with Roe v. Wade was that it went too far too fast, and it gave pro-lifers a focal point to rally around. You know, the March for Life each year is on the anniversary of Roe for a reason. So what the left is doing on this is, rather than having one sweeping Supreme Court ruling that strikes down marriage laws all across the country, they're having dozens of lower court rulings like this, dozens of district and circuit court rulings that are activist decisions redefining marriages by judges, disregarding the will of the people when there's nothing in the Constitution that requires the redefinition of marriage. You know, I laid out today, there are two different visions of what marriage is. And just appealing to the Equal Protection Clause doesn't at all tell you which vision is correct. So in Alito, when he cited our book in his dissenting opinion, we were hoping it would have been a majority opinion. But when he cited it, he was saying, look, there are two different visions of marriage. He cited us as defenders of one vision. He cited Jonathan Rauch and I think Andrew Sullivan as supporters of the other. He says, the Constitution is quiet on this, so it should resolve to the people and their elected officials. Now, what can we do in the meantime? There will be an election in November. The Senate could change hands. By the time a case like this got to the Supreme Court, the current composition of the court might change. There might be a retirement. If it's someone from the likely five that would vote in favor of striking down your marriage law, if it's a 4-4 court because the Senate won't confirm an Obama appointee, if this takes place when there's someone else in the White House and we get a new Supreme Court justice that actually wants to apply the law as written, we don't know what could happen. So there's still. So I just want to say we should still litigate all of these cases. One, because we shouldn't allow the other side to get away with this. Marriage is too important to just give up on it and allow the other side to use the courts to do their social engineering. When they couldn't win elections, they said, we'll just go through the court. But two, we don't know what the composition of the courts will look like in the future, and so we should keep defending these laws and then do the best that we can, given who will be on the court when these laws get there.
We've got a question back here, too. If you'll stand up, sir.
My name is... thank you for coming here. My name is Nicholas Rappier. I'm a student here at Criswell College. I was wondering, are there any examples of societies who have redefined marriage that we can look at, and what were the effects?
Not yet. Like I mentioned, it was the year 2000 that the first country redefined marriage, and it was 2003 that Massachusetts redefined marriage. And the types of effects that I'm talking about won't happen within a 5 to 10 year window. We're talking about how the law will teach over the course of generations. In the same way that no-fault divorce, those consequences didn't happen immediately, but it shaped a generation's worldview. In the same way that Roe v. Wade shaped younger people's view, but now my generation is different than my parents' generation. Those who came of age with Roe, but then the pro-life movement pushed back, and so there's been kind of a generational split. We don't know what will happen. Stanley Kurtz had done some research on Scandinavian countries to actually show that marriage rates drop off and that non-marital childbearing increases. That what it does is it destabilizes, it decenters the institution of marriage. We'll have to wait and see, what the long-term consequences are. But the predictions that I would make are precisely the things that I said in the third part of tonight's talk. That what this does is it changes our vision of what marriage is, and then our beliefs about marriage in turn shape our actions. If you think marriage is just about consenting adult love, that's how a society will come to live out marriage over time.
We got another question right here for this gentleman, if you'll stand up.
The very famous lawyer, I can't call his name, he lost his wife on 9/11.
Ted Olson.
Okay.
Ted Olson, yeah.
Yeah. I noticed, did he do that before the Supreme Court? Anyway, what he said multiple times was, this is the loving thing to do. And he halted, actually, and then he said, and it's in the Constitution. And he must have said that, I have no idea how many times. Now, what do we do about being called unloving?
Yeah. So Ted Olson is the famous conservative lawyer who argued Bush v. Gore before the Supreme Court in defense of Bush. And so he was a Federalist Society guy, and then I forget how many years ago he came out in favor of same-sex marriage, and not only as a policy matter said he was in favor of same-sex marriage, but he said the Constitution requires it. Which, as a judicial conservative and originalist, it's a really interesting question. So when did the Constitution begin to require this? When the 14th Amendment was passed? So in the 1800s? So if you were to ask him at what point did same-sex marriage become a constitutional right throughout history? Has it always been a constitutional right, or is this a living, breathing constitution, which typically conservatives don't really embrace? So there are two visions of marriage at stake here. There are also two different visions of the Constitution. There's kind of the originalist understanding, and then there's the judicial activist understanding of the Constitution. I think what we have to do is, he says that it's the loving thing to do. He also mentions the case Loving v. Virginia. And this was the Supreme Court case that struck down bans on interracial marriage. And those actually were bans. You could go to jail if you were in an interracial marriage. It was actually illegal. So it's actually accurate to use the word bans on interracial marriage. And what the court did there was it looked towards the history and the logic of the marital relationship. One of the things that I pointed out in a paper I've written for Heritage is that bans on interracial marriage are a relatively unique historical anomaly to the Americas, particularly to the 13 colonies and then to the United States of America. If you look through the great thinkers throughout human history, none of them thought skin color or race had anything to do with marriage. If you look through Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Locke, Kant, Gandhi, you never see a discussion of race, but you always see a discussion of male and female. And so marriage laws have to be colorblind because race is irrelevant to the ability of a man and a woman uniting, producing children, and then raising those children. But marriage laws can't be gender blind. And so part of, I think, what we have to do as a response is not allow the left to make it seem like defending the truth about marriage is the same thing as racism. In fact, the logic of striking down the bans on interracial marriage is precisely that the bans on interracial marriage were a redefinition of marriage. Up until we instituted bans on interracial marriage, marriage had never been a race-based institution. And so it was precisely to uphold the race-based slave trade. If you want to continue segregating society based on race, you can't have any biracial or interracial children. So you have to cordon off the races. So it was in order to perpetuate a wicked regime of race-based slavery and then Jim Crow legislation that we redefined marriage to define it in terms of race. And the equal protection, the 14th Amendment, was precisely meant to get us to a colorblind Constitution. The 14th Amendment, ratified as one of the Reconstruction Amendments, was precisely meant to weed out that sort of racial discrimination. To then say that it's meant to actually redefine marriage, to say something that no thinker in human history up until the year 2000 had ever even argued for, is to turn the Constitution upside down.
Great. We're going to take a question here and then one more. And I think Ryan will be available afterward to take a question here and then one more.
I'm Mark Yablon, and Ryan, your comment about the roofer analogy hit home. In divorce court, they give you 20 minutes to discuss separating the children, the assets, and the marriage. 20 minutes per side, which is far less than the roofer gets to dispute. What would you suggest as a way to change that, other than the obvious change the law?
Well, I mean, I think so. This is a tough issue because right now I don't know of any political party or any politician that's willing to actually take this on. Although many scholars and policymakers agree that the laws that we had governing divorce 50 years ago weren't ideal, but the reform went too far in the other direction. So it was too adversarial, the burden of proof was too high back then, so there was a problem that needed addressing. But the cure that we got was almost as bad as the disease in the first place. So then how do you swing the pendulum? And this frequently happens with policy debates. You see a problem, you way overcompensate. It's what happened with Obamacare. There was a problem with health care. We went way too far. How do you then reform the reform? And I don't have a good answer for you on that. Partly because I don't see much willingness of people to work together to try to actually create better divorce law. But it's something we should be thinking about and trying to do what we can, but I don't have a good answer.
Well, and I know our organization has been talking a lot about this issue because there has been efforts to lengthen waiting periods. There's marriage education courses and some of those things, but you haven't seen a whole lot of political will to do those type of things.
And that reminds me, so there's a really good book called The Forever Initiative. It's written by a professor at BYU, and it explores an Oklahoma state program meant for exactly the type of marriage education that you're talking about. Completely voluntary, so no one's forced to go to these classes, but teaching people relationship skills so that they can work on improving and saving their marriage. And his evaluation is that it actually has a good effect. That this is a program that actually does improve the longevity and the quality of marriages. So that's a good point. It's a good reminder.
Okay, this is our last question.
Pastor Broden, certainly I pastor in a community where we can empirically document the adverse impact of single parents. My question is that your approach, your Aristotelian approach to argumentation is a good one. However, I think there is a 1-2 punch that is missing here because you have not included or integrated the theological. And I think the two together will make a greater impact in the public square as to the relevancy and the necessity for maintaining a traditional view of marriage. So it seems to me that there ought to be an amalgamation of the two as opposed to a segregation of the two.
Yep.
Could you explain your reasoning?
Sure.
One
So
versus the other?
I agree with you entirely. I think this is more a division of labor. That the philosophers will be doing the philosophical account, and the pastors and the theologians will be doing the theological account. And I don't think there's anything in the philosophical account that we've given that would conflict with a good theology of marriage. That faith and reason go together on this. And so we chose to do the reason side, do the philosophy side, partly because we wanted this to be something that would be accessible to those who don't share any faith commitments. And so we said, our role is going to be speaking that part. And in no way do we want to silence you from speaking your part or from bringing them together from the pulpit or anything like that. So we don't want to suggest that the only argument to make for marriage is the philosophical and social science. We think that Martin Luther King Jr. actually provides a really great illustration that you want to have all voices at the table. The civil rights movement was led, we were going to have the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. If you look at Martin Luther King Jr.'s his speeches, his sermons, he's integrating this stuff seamlessly. His letter from Birmingham jail cites Aquinas and Augustine on the natural law to say that an unjust law is no law at all. I just think that for us, we didn't go that route because the audience we were trying to reach was an audience that wasn't going to share many of those faith commitments that you hold.
Great. Well, thank
So
you.
let me close with one thing, because I think the question about where do we go from here is another question that I think to end with this is something, an example that I point to, a parallel that I point to is the pro-life movement. And so I think this would be what I would want to leave you with. In February of 1973, it would have been very easy for the pro-life community to say, we lost. It would have been easy for them to believe the New York Times, the Supreme Court had just settled the abortion issue. If you think back to the early, mid, late 70s, you had pro-life politicians evolve and become pro-choice. People like Bill Clinton and Al Gore and Ted Kennedy and Jesse Jackson were all at one point pro-life. And then after they evolved and become pro-choice. The media kept insisting that pro-lifers were on the wrong side of history. They pointed to the young generation and say, look, there's a demographic divide. All of the young people are in favor of abortion. At one point, public opinion got to be something along the lines of 66% in favor of abortion and only 33% pro-life. So 2/3 to 1/3. They said that, it's going to eventually just be the Pope in Rome and Americans in nursing homes who are pro-life. That's what they were trying. It's the same thing they're saying now. But the reality now for the pro-life movement is that my generation is more pro-life than my parents' generation. A majority of Americans now identify as pro-life. More state pro-life laws have been passed in the past decade than in the previous 3 decades combined. And so what took place was that pro-lifers didn't give up. They organized, they got together, they put their hand to the plow, and they started bearing witness to the truth about life. And as Jonathan mentioned when he introduced me, that we're just starting to have that conversation about marriage. And so regardless of what happens at the circuit courts and what happens potentially with the Supreme Court, that doesn't answer or finalize or settle this debate. This is a question that we're going to be engaged in for the long haul, and over time, the truth wins out. Over time, if we make the arguments for marriage, people will respond because the truth has a certain luminosity, it has a certain attractiveness, and it resonates with people. But we have to be its best messengers. The truth needs a messenger, and that's our vocation. And it's a vocation that can take many different shapes. Not all of us have to do public policy and philosophy. We have roles for artists, for musicians, for painters, for pastors. There's a role for everyone in this, whatever your given talents are. So with that, I'll finish my remarks and turn it over back to Jonathan.
And if you'll Thank y'all very much for your attention. I just want to make a remark while Ryan's still on the stage. One of the things that the national media was saying after last week was, and I was taking a lot of calls from national media, is that all the attention was going to be focused now on Texas or the area, this part of the country, because of this being one of the few states that haven't ruled yet on this issue. And so a lot of people think the landmark decision is going to come from Texas or the Fifth Circuit, which Texas is a part of at the federal level. And what they were saying was the marriage issue has become the Alamo issue for Texas, right? Making that connection. And so, but I just want to make this point. My last name, there was people that were fighting in the Texas Republic with the Signs last name. And what we also know, if we know our Texas history, is that after the Alamo was the Battle of San Jacinto. And I like to say, along with Ted Cruz, I grew up under the shadow of the San Jacinto Monument in the city of Houston. And I'll tell you what, if I need someone to fight with me, to be there and make sure it gets done, I want to have Ryan Anderson there with me.